In animation, there are no accidents. That means every detail, big or small, was handcrafted by an artist. From the composition, to the lighting, to the layout of the background, down to the textures and movement. They're all decisions that had to be made and meticulously planned. To me, Avatar is an animated movie, but like The Lion King, its style is photorealism. Photos meaning a picture captured through a camera lens, and reality, capturing all the nuance and detail of real life. So how do they achieve such a giant leap forward in photorealism since Avatar 1 came out 13 years ago? Well, to be honest, there's something I gotta tell you. Every clip so far is from Avatar 1. You know what? I think there's been such a focus on the technology in Avatar 2, and it is impressive. But I believe the technology is not why Way of the Water looks so great. It's the decisions and filmmaking language from a master director who spent years creating films in the ocean. But what is it about Avatar 2 that looks so good? What's up? My name's Josh Tunin, and for the last 8 years I've been working as an artist and supervisor on Hollywood visual effects on movies like Star Wars, Deadpool, and Across the Spider-Verse. But more important than that, I just love movies and I'm super passionate about making them. So today I want to break down what makes the visual effects of Avatar 2 Way of the Water so special, how they achieve the photorealistic look, the lighting and compositing techniques, and break down the art fundamentals that go into these amazing, breathtaking underwater VFX shots, and hopefully help develop your artistic eye and how you're looking at these shots so you can implement these techniques in your own film. So let's start with this question. If there are no accidents in CG, how do you create them? James Cameron's answer to this is performance capture. It's a way for the actors to come together and craft a performance and find their accidents along the way.
People ask me, how do you balance the humanistic, emotional side of it with all the layers and layers of technology? On a film like this with so much virtual production, then there's something really lovely about just having a moment that's pure creation. And I love that with the actors, obviously.
In order to see the nuance of the characters, they evolved their facial rigs beyond what they had in the first Avatar.
The emotion, the dynamic energy of the face actually progresses all the way down to the upper chest because there's so many tendons and throat movement and muscles that fire in the neck, and you're not really aware of it until you really start breaking down and studying how people emote.
Another aspect of the photoreal equation is scale. I think this is the most common mistake and difference between artists just starting out and VFX professionals. It's their ability to match the scale of the real world. And in Avatar, the scale is so important because we have 6-foot-tall humans standing next to 9-foot-tall Na'vi. But let's talk about the scale of the performance. I think this breaks down to 2 factors, size and speed. Let's take a look at this clip between the Ikron and the Great Leonopteryx, which is 3 times their size. Generally speaking, something that's smaller moves faster and something that's bigger moves slower. Now watch the wing speed between the red dragon here and the blue dragons in the foreground, and how the speed of their wings reinforces their scale and size. This is true of animals, characters, but it's also true of effects elements like water and smoke. Now let's talk about simulation and really pay attention to the size, speed, and movement here. Even the speed and scale of the cloth simulations make it more believable. Look at the difference of speed between this thin leather tarp in the back compared to how slow the cloth is moving on Jake's body. And then the speed of his hair is somewhere in between these two. And by looking at the speed of their movement, it tells us how fast Jake is moving through the air. These simulations are created by the effects and character effects departments. Effects is where technology meets artistry. The effects and character effects departments create the water simulations, the air bubbles, but also the underwater hair and cloth. This is where the reference footage that they get on the motion capture stage becomes so important when achieving photorealism. The unique approach on Avatar here, they're creating the costume and moving through water and capturing real life footage so that the effects artists don't have to guess what reality should look like. They're able to analyze the footage and match what they're seeing in the computer and get that much closer to reality. If we look at these 2 clips between the underwater footage of Avatar 1 and Avatar 2, if you look closely, they're much faster because there's no resistance as they're making the motion of moving through the water. But in Avatar 2, their motions are a lot simpler, slower, and fluid because they're capturing the real life motion in a water tank. But it's not just photorealism that makes Avatar 2 look so good. There's something even more fundamental at play that James Cameron and the team behind Avatar do better than almost anybody else. And that's the way they create depth in every single shot. It's the layers of depth they create between the foreground, midground, and background. Let's dissect this shot and look at all the different ways they're creating depth in this single clip. Well, first off, there's very clear separation from the foreground that we have at the top of the frame. The same goes for having the water almost touch the camera at the bottom of the frame. We have things very close to camera. Now if we look at these floating rocks in the midground, these give us some really nice detail up close, but it also gives us cues for how large these rocks would have to be far away in the distance. And because we're repeating similar geometry, if you look at the top right side of frame, these feel so much further away because we know what they look like up close. Now let's look at the atmosphere. If you look at how dark the blacks are in our foreground, when you look at the character's hair, you can see the further we go into the background, the more lifted our rocks are because of the atmosphere. With our circular rocks in the background, even though they're a different shape than the floating islands, the atmosphere on top of them makes them feel very far away. And in this shot, they go one step further and do something really cool with having the sun in the shot. You really can't have something further away than the sun itself. So we have the water that's almost touching the camera lens, going all the way back into the depths of space, super far away with our sunlight here, and it's illuminating this planet in front of it, giving us all these different depth cues that make this one simple shot feel absolutely massive.
I really like hand holding during action just to get that kind of roughness and that instinctiveness. And so then in the virtual production, try to do the same thing.
What makes the cameras feel so real is they're capturing the motion on the performance capture stage. They're tracking the position of the camera as it moves through the real world. This keeps the cameras grounded and true to life and shows us that motion is a key component in photorealism. Also create depth through movement. In a shot like this, we obviously have our foreground characters moving through the frame, but we create a composition through the movement of these banshees flying below that are creating movement and intersecting with this main line running through our composition. Then towards the end of the shot, we also have the birds that are coming in this opposite direction. And the main goal of composition is to focus our eye within a frame. And every element here, from the geometry to the movement of the characters, and the flying birds and banshees in the background are all leading our eye to where the characters are going in the center of the frame. You also have to admire how much depth is being created in such a quick shot like this. If we pause in the beginning, you can see we have the same idea of these floating islands having some in the foreground, midground, and background. But if you look on screen right here, way off into the distance, we have even more floating islands in this tiny pocket over here. And there's so much atmosphere, clouds, and depth between our midground rocks and this deep background layer. It's so lifted, it's almost the same color of the sky. But the fact that we can see all the way into the horizon here is what gives this shot a ton of depth. But when we're in the ocean, all we have is water. So how did they create depth in these underwater shots? Now in a shot like this, we don't have a massive expanse of a background that we can play with because you lose visibility underwater very, very quickly. But they have some really clever tricks here to build depth in the scene. The first one are these God rays. Because of the direction of these God rays here, they're all pointing in perspective to something off screen. So immediately we can tell where the sun is, and by moving the camera, it implies that there's something bigger off screen above the frame. So it feels like the environment expands beyond the top edge of the frame. We also have this school of fish at the very beginning that starts in the foreground, again, almost touching the camera, that we rush past and they scatter away into the background. There's also all these particles on screen left that we whoosh by, and the size of them gets smaller depending on how far back they go into the background. And now in a shot like this, where we just have water, we don't have any fish, particles, air bubbles, or anything like that, they use the surface of the water, where again, you can almost feel the water touching the camera lens to create depth in this shot. And this to me is why the 3D looked so good in Avatar 2 and Avatar 1. There's so much depth in just a two-dimensional image, and there's all these cues from the foreground to the background that help us feel all these different layers of depth. One of my biggest pet peeves of YouTube video essays are the harsh critiques thrown at the visual effects field, but no one is willing to show some shots of their own. So I wanted to include one of my own shots and break down what I think works and what I would change based on what I learned from Avatar 2. So this shot was finished in 2019 in between Avatar 1 and Avatar 2, but I remember referencing Avatar 1 to understand how to create depth in this underwater scene. I tried adding in some God rays into the foreground that we would rush past with the camera. And now the animation of this camera helped drastically because it has such a dynamic movement that we can create parallax with all the different particles, stock elements, and God rays that we have here. And I found some stock elements of different stones and pebbles that I could place in the midground and even in the deep background here. And lastly, as we got to the surface of the water, this is where I tried to cram in as many stock elements of bubbles, water, and I tried defocusing them as they got closer and closer to the camera lens. And by breaking through the surface of the water here, we tried to recreate the look of water touching the lens. And to make this feel like it expands beyond the edges of the frame, there's a subtle gradient in the color of the water, where it's brighter towards the surface of the water and darker towards the bottom of the frame. And now after seeing Avatar 2, if I had the opportunity to go back and recomposite this shot, the number one thing I would do is definitely add more particles into the foreground. It's obvious through all the different schools of fish and air bubbles that they added into every shot that it's very hard to go overboard, and it really helps create a lot of additional movement and parallax in any shot underwater. And I hope by now you can start to see Avatar and other films in a new way, to look beyond the still images and see how James Cameron elevates his own films using these simple art fundamentals to create more immersive and meaningful images. So that's why I realized after coming out of the theater on my second watch through that everything that's so great and works in Avatar 2 is what makes Avatar 1 so special and hold up 13 years later. And it's because the same fundamentals are there between both movies, using movement, scale, and depth to create photorealism that look great to this day. In a world filled with YouTube armchair critics and cinema sins, I want to celebrate movies when something like Avatar 2 comes out. I hope you feel the same, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see my own journey trying to use these same virtual production techniques at home using Unreal Engine.